Okay, we might make a start. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's panel discussion. My name is Theckla Gunga from the Department of Pacific Affairs here at the ANU, and it's my pleasure to chair this session. Before I start, let me begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land where we're meeting today and pay my respects to the elders of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people, past, present, and emerging. Our event today is a collaboration between the Department of Pacific Affairs and the Lowy Institutes Australia Papua New Guinea network. And in addition to our live audience here today, we have and extend a very warm welcome to our online audience. We're going to be recording proceedings, and the recording will be made available on DPA's YouTube channel at a later date. The title of today's event is Bougainville at a Crossroads, Leadership, Development, and the 2027 Independence Horizon. And the title reflects the critical juncture that Bougainville finds itself as it charts its path forward following the 2019 referendum and the recent landslide re-election of President Ishmael Toroama, which appears to be a strong public endorsement for his stance on achieving independence by the target date of September the 1st, 2027, as recommended by the Bougainville Leaders Consultation Forum earlier this year. Many challenging issues remain, including that of ratification by PNG's National Parliament. There are many still unfulfilled provisions in the original peace agreement, and the need for a clear roadmap to achieving political and economic independence. Our panel today will explore the policy, institutional, and developmental priorities that need to be addressed in the lead up to 2027, and we'll examine how both the PNG and the Bougainville governments can navigate this decisive phase in their shared history. We have an impressive panel of young professionals from the region with us today for the discussion. Following the panel discussion, we'll have time for Q&A from members of our live and online audiences. The moderator for our discussion is Theckla Gunga-Jogo, who is a Port Moresby-based broadcast journalist currently working for the ABC, and Theckla has been covering major news events in PNG and in the region over the past 10 years. Welcome, Theckla. Our other panel members, we have with us today Oliver Nobitar, who I think is very well known to many of you. And Ollie is a research fellow and project director of the Australia Papua New Guinea network at the Lowy Institute. Welcome, Ollie. Thank you. We have Yambari Haihue, who's a Master of Public Policy student here at the ANU. And Yambari was formerly Deputy Director of Transparency International PNG, where he led national anti-corruption advocacy. Welcome, Yambari. We also have Laurel Pentani, who's a Bougainville consultant and chairs the Bougainville Tourism Association. And Laurel has experience in public policy, women's leadership, and sustainable local enterprise. Welcome, Laurel. And finally, but by no means least, Michaela Long is Investment and Communication Manager at Pacific Trade Invest Australia, and is a Fijian-Australian professional who is engaged in fostering Pacific-led inclusive economic growth through regional partnerships. Welcome, Michaela. And without further ado, Theckla, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Good to see you all. Hello to all our audience online. We're all here to talk about issues on Bougainville. I won't take any much more time. We'll get straight into it. Oliver, congratulations, first of all, for the great work that you've done on Bougainville. It remains an important group, and it's important for us emerging leaders and those of us in areas where we can discuss and talk more about Bougainville issues, continue to do so. Oliver, I will start off with you.
Sure.
You have recently published your Lowy Institute policy brief on Bougainville, and it's titled Bougainville's Future, a Roadmap for Development. You're from Bougainville, Port Bougainville. Tell us about why you decided to address this important topic on socio-economical development, and what were some of the key findings and recommendations that you came up?
Yeah, cool. Thank you. Thank you very much for the question, Theckla, and thank you everyone for joining today, and my colleagues as well. It's such a pleasure to be really on this panel with everyone else. I'll give you the condensed version of the research paper that I published with Lowy Institute last month to really save you the pain of having to read it yourself. To start off with, I had undertaken this research as a question as part of my fellowship as the FDC Pacific Research Fellow last year at Lowy. And the decision to do this and to focus on Bougainville was really based on my own personal experience. As Theckla has mentioned, I am also a Bougainvillean. My father's from Bougainville. And I'm also someone who I guess is on the receiving end of a lot of these socio-economic development questions, as someone who frequently goes back to what I refer to as home back in Bougainville. I did a podcast as well last month where I talked about what are those sort of triggers that made me want to ask these questions around socio-economic development. Some of these personal factors were that, like a death of my cousin a few years ago, who had passed away as a result of really the lack of health, the degree of health services that we have available in Buka Hospital, which is supposed to be the biggest one on the island. I also talked about questions that my uncle had asked he had asked my father, and my uncle is considered as those people who were part of the lost generation, asking the question, what did we sort of fight for, right? So a lot of those questions were sort of, I was ruminating on, and when you grow up and you have parents who have grown up in the era of Bougainville and what a lot of people refer to as the good times, sort of the economic powerhouse that Bougainville was at the time, there's a strong sense of identity amongst Bougainvillians for that reputation that they built of sort of being, innovative, being hardworking. Arawa was a place where all of Papua New Guinea had flocked to go and work for BCL at the time. But I was born in a generation where I didn't see those realities, right? And I struggled to see sort of what was being referenced, and I wanted to contribute, I guess, to a desire, I think, that a lot of Bougainvillians have, a desire for re-emergence, I guess, of Bougainville people, and not just to sort of that level of prestige that they had before and the economic power that I guess like Bougainville had, but also was a major contributor back to PNG as a nation as well. So that was sort of one of the reasons why I decided to undertake that. And another thing as well, and I'm sure we'll talk about a lot, even though that it was sort of discussed really on the fringes of the paper, was sort of on the independence question. One of my biggest concerns as a Bougainvillian was that I felt that the narrative so far that's been pushed has made it a little bit limiting for Bougainvillians as well. I use the word, and it may be a little bit sensitive, but I kind of use the term as like a sort of a one-trick pony. I want to demonstrate that we're able to contribute to a lot more, not just on independence, but in other areas as well. And they don't only have to be Bougainville related, it could be to the rest of the region, to the rest of the country and the rest of the region as well. So that's sort of my intentions behind the paper. So what I tried to answer when looking at this question was, why was socioeconomic development not always considered with the same sort of priority as the independence movement? And more importantly, I try to answer what can we do about it, and how can I contribute to us having this discussion more often. So the findings that were in my paper are by no means groundbreaking in any way. But I did realize that this isn't always expressed in the literature. Another key factor as well while researching, which is quite surprising to me, is that there's a pertinent sort of absence of Bougainvillean voices on this topic, especially in literature. I benefited heavily from the literature by external sources, and I'm really grateful that many of them are here today. One of them, Professor Anthony Regan, obviously. But I realize that Bougainvilleans as well need to be able to contribute, not just on the floor of Parliament when they're having these debates or on social media, but we should be able to put something down in literature as a timestamp for our thinking at any sort of point in time. So really briefly going through the findings, I tried to approach this questions that I had through a three-tiered approach, right? The political level, the institutional level, as well as the technical level. Now, what I did find is that, unsurprisingly, the peace agreement was focused largely on the independence pursuit, right? Over 3/4 of the document focuses on this pursuit for independence. And initially, I referred to it as a shortfall, but I changed it sort of at the last minute because I think the best way to describe it is a limitation. Because I think, now that I think about it, it's foolish to think that they could have covered socio-economic development means and gotten both parties to come and sign it, right? I think at the end of the bottom line was that this is a political document that needed to be signed, and that's what got the parties to the table. And I think Kevin Pullen had done his presentation just a few weeks ago, talking about how this peace agreement has succeeded over the past 2 decades, really, and maintained that peace. The other findings that I found is that socio-economic development indicators are also performing quite poorly, and poorly compared to the national average. Back in 2016, infant mortality rate was lower than the national average, and life expectancy as well for Bougainvilleans was lower than the national average. And the other one, of course, economic performance. In the 2024 budget, the internal revenue generated on the island of Bougainville was equated to only about 7% of its total budget. Majority of the money coming in externally from outside. Looking at the institutional setup, there's a huge data gap as well. I relied heavily on what was prepared by UNDP called the Bougainville Socio-Economic Baseline Survey Report. That's a mouthful. But I relied heavily on that data, and it showed through sort of its findings and studies with technical officers within ABG that the institutional setup is not adequate to cater for the intended purposes of the government and how it's going to function. And obviously the last one is the frustrations around the drawdown of powers and the lack of capacity building in that relationship between the national government and Bougainville. So moving forward, the recommendations in the paper, what to do. I proposed something called like a Bougainville Peace Agreement 2.0. What that is intended to do is sort of address that political tier that I was looking at. I think politically, there needs to be a new agreement that's focused specifically on how Bougainville and the national government can cooperate to bolster socio-economic development. And ideally, this is going to be kept separately from any sort of questions on the political future. Why? Is because I think it's going to muddle it too much. It's going to tie in development with the politics if you put them both together. But also, I know the work that's already being done with the Melanesia framework that's signed earlier this year, and I think that's already quite successfully charting the path towards sort of that the resolution of sort of the political ambiguities. The other one as well, also not a new idea, is sort of that the Bougainville Peace Agreement hasn't been, it's not new. It has been discussed before, but in different forms, and that was sort of the form that I had sort of advocated for. Another idea as well, which is also not new, is the proposal of a new institution called the Bougainville Development Authority. Once again, this isn't new. In the early 2010s, there was something called the Bougainville Restoration and Development Authority that had I sort of hypothesize as being modeled quite a lot off of the success of the Gazelle Restoration Authority that was set up after the volcanic eruption over in Rabaul. And I wanted to use the same model as well. And what ideally this authority should operate as, it should be be seen as a project implementation unit, where it's the clearinghouse or sort of the common area for all partners, so donor partners, national government, Bougainville government, to come together and agree on the projects that they want to implement moving forward. So that's sort of what I'd hope, and hopefully by them doing that, a separate sort of authority to do that, it alleviates the the pressure on the Bougainville government right now to exercise its fiscal responsibilities as well, and allow it the breathing room to focus on the third recommendation in the paper, which is on capacity building, right? And there's a lot of frustration saying that the drawdown process is taking too long. Why isn't it happening? And there's a lot of people, the commentary is that, it's a result of politicking on behalf of the national government. I think that it's because of the lack of, there's ambiguity around how drawdown is supposed to take place. So while the Sharp Agreement a few years ago had tried to remove a lot of the prerequisites, what I propose is that this is where you need to oversubscribe now in this sense, right? You need to further prescribe so there's so much clarity in how that process is supposed to look. And that's sort of the third recommendation. So that's sort of it in a nutshell. And ideally, if all of that is done, when 2027 comes around, treating that as sort of a political reality, whatever the question, whether it's successful or not, you either enter into a new country that has some sort of a foundation for socio-economic development, or if you don't, you still sort of have made some sort of inroads in that area as well. So that's sort of the main gist of the paper. So, yeah.
Thank you, Ali. I think the recommendation on the new agreement for socio-economical aspect is really important for the people, because it's the people.
Yeah,
that
absolutely.
I'll go to you, Barry. You have been involved as an election observer during the 2019 referendum in Bougainville and have a proven record of working with civil society organizations with a particular focus on governance, good governance. Could you share some views on the current state governance practices in Bougainville? And if I can add, what lessons do you think Bougainville can draw from PNG governance, if any? And like both good and bad.
Yeah, thank you, Theckla. That's a big question. Before I start, I want to also acknowledge the traditional landowners who are meeting today, the Nanawal and Namri people. Also acknowledge the people that have sponsored this event, Louis. I am currently doing my master's, but also currently in the exam period here at ANU. But I thought this was an important event and an important occasion to discuss issues that are happening here on what has been a historic year for Papua New Guinea in terms of reflection on its 50th independence anniversary, but also the important declaration recently and the election of Bougainville President Toroama. I think it's an important juncture for us to consider governance and its implications both within PNG and in Bougainville. I think my connection with Bougainville is not personal. I did not grow up in Bougainville. I do not have relatives from Bougainville. But I don't think of Bougainville as a Bougainville issue, but a Papua New Guinea issue. My engagement with Bougainville has been at the start really professional. I was part of the KIPNG observation team for the referendum. It was not an election, but KIPNG had observed elections previously, and I was involved in 2017 and 22, and hopefully 27 when I get back. But so we put together a team to observe the conduct of the referendum in North Bougainville and in Central Bougainville. We didn't get time to go to South Bougainville. But I was there in Buka on the first day of polling, and overnight drove from Buka down to Kieta to see the conduct of polling happening in Central Bougainville. And I still remember driving that night along the road and just hearing so much celebration and so many joyous people singing through midnight into the early hours of the morning. And I felt a deep sense of obligation to the people of Bougainville, that what the government of Papua New Guinea and their government signed in the peace agreement should be fulfilled. It's a duty of care that the government of Papua New Guinea has to the people of Bougainville. And I think that's an important point to reflect on. A lot of the problems and issues that have been highlighted in all these papers can be seen as not Bougainville's sins, but PNG's sins that have been inherited or been passed on. You look at infant mortality in Bougainville, you look at infant mortality in PNG. You look at infrastructure in Bougainville, look at infrastructure in PNG. If you study the history of Bougainville, it's a study of governance in PNG. It looks at the mining agreements that are done, free prior informed consent, the basis of global mining governance that developed after the Bougainville crisis in response to the issues in PNG. The makeup of PNG's government changed. We had reforms looking at subnational government because of Bougainville. the Chen government fell because of a military uprising, because of what was seen as unconstitutional acts. It's actually the other way around. You can't look at Papua New Guinean governance without looking at Bougainvillean governance. It informs the history of how governance is conceptualized in PNG, because the state learned a lot of these things by engaging on Bougainville. When do you deploy troops? How do you sign comprehensive peace agreements? How do you draw down powers? And so it's been a testing ground. And when you start off from a poor basis in PNG, it is it's expected that you will have failure in transfers of policy. Bougainville payments haven't been made by the state government. So have many provinces and districts in PNG. They've been politicized in Bougainville, they've been politicized in PNG. Some would say that the government of Bougainville, because of Torama's election, is in some ways more mandated than the government of PNG. You look at the conduct of elections, how many electoral disputes, how many elections should have been failed, but they do not. The legitimacies of the governments, if you compare them, I would say stand more strongly in favor of Bougainville as a mandated agency to engage. I'm also concerned by government comments, for instance, following the signing of the Papua Treaty. Senior officials were saying, if citizens are concerned, we can just walk back from it and scrap the treaty. There is a deep concern on the side of government on Papua New Guinea in terms of its ability to represent its people and to ensure that it complies with agreements that it signs. These are deep governance problems. So when you look at the date of September 2027, the return of writs after the 2027 elections are supposed to be in July for PNG. You might have, we have a motion of no confidence in PNG's government as we speak. So you might have an O'Neill government, you might have a Marpa government or some other piece that comes in. And to what extent do Papua New Guineans have confidence that that government will have carriage of this complicated process? My fear with this paper from Oli is, and I remember speaking with Oli about this in, I think 2 years ago when he was first constructing the idea. My fear is that it gives credence to people that say Bougainville needs to meet development goals before it can gain independence. And I think those are two very different questions. One is about the rule of law and processes that were outlined in the Bougainville Peace Agreement. If we have a Bougainville Peace Agreement 2.0 that outlines it, more better for it. But in the absence of that, we have a duty and an obligation to fulfill the peace agreement as it is. There's obviously legal technicalities over the process of ratification and how does that look in PNG's parliament, what the orders will be, how it will be tabled, and how it will be passed. But we have to act in good faith. One of the pillars of the Bougainville Peace Agreement, or one of the understandings. The difficulty in terms of governance is, can we ensure that the Papua New Guinean government will uphold its end of the bargain? Unfortunately, if you look at the constitutional track record in Papua New Guinea, the politicians have often fallen short. And we fall back onto the courts to re-establish order as the last line of defense. And so when I think about Bougainville, the mandate, the overwhelming support in the referendum, I also hear about the concerns about its development status. But you have to look at it in context. And I don't want anyone watching online or in the audience to feel that because of the development indicators that we should kick the can down the road. I'm concerned about that. There's a declaration made by Toroama. He said September as the date in 2027. There has to be then dialogue on what that looks like. Oli has given some guidance about what could be considered as a framework. There are other countries within our region, Timor-Leste, for example, which went for a similar pathway. And there are ways that you can maneuver between now and 2027. And a responsible government would have to take those steps on the PNG side, on the Bougainville side. Looking at it dispassionately, not as a Papua New Guinean or someone that's invested in the process, I think of similar sized countries in the Pacific. Vanuatu has 3 times the landmass of Bougainville, but about similar comparison of people, 300,000 to 400,000 people. The economies in the Pacific in some ways are comparable to Western Bougainville if it were to gain independence tomorrow. That's without any of the bilateral aid, without the Panguna mine restarting, the similar conditions. If you look back at PNG's independence in 1975, if we applied the standard of socio-economic indicators, was Australia right to give independence, given that PNG didn't have any higher education institution up to 67, didn't have any public facilities that trained civil service, embedded rule of law. So we have to be really honest with ourselves. We cannot judge the Bougainville development indicators ex nihilo out of nothing. We have to look at it in the history of PNG, in the history of the Pacific, the context and the development indicators, and then we draw the line and say, look, if the process is in place, we have to follow through with it. And now it's on us to make sure that we follow through in the way that's best for PNG and the best for Bougainville. And it will always be this because Bougainville has been at the forefront of developing PNG as a state. Whitlam, when he gave independence to PNG in 75, said that Australia can never be free until PNG is free. And I think the same kind of applies to PNG. We can't be free if we don't follow through with our commitment to Bougainville. We can't, in honest decency, treat Bougainville differently from how we consider issues of injustice across the border in West Papua, for instance. We have to be consistent. Yeah, so I think I welcome the report by Oli, but I think we should look at it in context and we should work wholeheartedly with counterparts in Bougainville to be like on a peace agreement.
Thank you.
Can I make one? Sort of. No, just really quick because you touched on it. Sorry, I don't want to take away from everyone else real quick. But on that point that you touched on in terms of should socio-economic indicators be met before independence? And I think I approached the paper initially looking at that, right? How can we say we're ready when that doesn't happen? But it's true. At the end of it, I was convinced through the conversations that I had that it's not a prerequisite to happen. But then there was a deeper question that asked that if that's not the case, then the deeper question we have to ask is why are then we pursuing independence? And as a Bougainvillean, my sort of view of it was that I'm sorry, I'm not trying to draw social license with that, but it was saying that you should be pushing for independence because it should lead to the prosperity and better livelihood of your people, right? And it's because of that that I asked the question, and it's not discussed in the paper, right? Which is why I focus on that, right? This is what you have to do, socio-economic development. And does independence add to that? Maybe, but I don't think it makes a massive difference, right? And past the powers that are already allowed in the autonomous government. But that's another question I guess we can try to do a question and answer time. But thanks for raising that as well. That was a good point I'm going to touch on. Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, thank you. Good points you've made on PNG upholding, the PNG government upholding its end of the bar, and really there's no process there in Parliament to sort of rectify the referendum. So I'll go to Laurel. Speaking of you have experience with foreign services and business operations in Bougainville, and you are a leader, the chair of the Central Bougainville Tourism Association. That's really interesting. Tell us about, from your perspective, how do you describe the environment that Bougainvilleans experience in their daily lives? And what are the key insights that you've drawn from your experience as a Bougainville woman doing business back in Bougainville?
Thank you, Theckla. Abhinol Ogata. Yeah, I had to think about the question that you were going to raise. I think in one sentence, I would describe it, the environment is rigid, yet perspective. If I just answer that in one line. I made a few notes. I've got about 5 or 6 points. And this will speak also to Oli's paper in terms of socio-economic development, separate from what's politically being, what the political ambitions are on the ground between the ABG or Autonomous Bougainville government and the government of PNG. As a woman, I would say some of the insights I've encountered or learned while on the ground would be that firstly, women are also socially very much a part of decision making. Women are also very important in the Bougainville Peace Agreement. for this case, probably 1.0 only, and probably 2.0 too. They should be a part of that. In terms of business operations on the ground, I think I'm also here to be a practical example or give some practical realities so that you can reflect on that as an audience, but also as a panel, and to also support paper and literature going forward for the Bougainville issue. So I think firstly, there are many, I said rigid, yet perspective, but there are many, I say rigid, but there are also many lucrative opportunities that are available. I think as someone who does business on the ground, it's just a matter of really abiding by the traditional laws, but also the rules that are in place on the ground. And much of that can just be drawn basically from just being very honest or making honest effort when you want to do business operations, or if you're coming in as an investor. I also think that's very important for trust and development. And you know, as a Bougainvillean as well, we want to see that there's an honest effort being made by people who are coming in, whether it's the PNG government, whether it's researchers, you know, whoever it is. I think another perspective that I've encountered or learned while on the ground is in terms of models, and in terms of business operations. I think it's very important that having hybrid models going forward, you know, I think we should be increasing the appetite of everybody, not only traditional owners, but also developers or investors coming in, so that you're creating these models as you go along. It's a post-conflict society, obviously. There's been armed conflict. So I think it's also very important that there's no precedence. So it's very important that you take things step by step. And that starts with just having an open mind and creating possibly hybrid models. Apart from that, I think the foundation of creating these hybrid models also should speak to what Ollie's paper does mention, which is sort of laying the foundations for and basing it on the realities on the ground in terms of Bougainville's economic priorities, also their social development goals, and you know, bearing in mind the political aspirations. Of course, that has to be taken into consideration with the PNG government. We're still a part of Papua New Guinea until 2027.
We'll find out.
We'll find out. I think another point that I encountered was that for business operations was that it is high risk, but if you fabricate your models well, it can be high returns, so you can realize returns. And this is not only applicable for business, but it's also applicable to government systems and models, to social development, and whatever else. But that's just from my point of view, and today. Apart from that, there has been, I think, from a social perspective and as a woman on the ground, as is the case in many other war-torn countries or where there's been a lot of destruction, there's a lot of trauma still there, which needs to be addressed. And social development in relation to what Oliver has mentioned would also look at some sort of, I'm not sure how to mention, but some social development in terms of not necessarily psychology, but
Yeah. I know what you mean. It's sort of like dealing with sort of the trauma of the conflict, right? Yeah, because there's no avenues for
I think so.
dealing with that. Yeah, that's true.
Probably mental health.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, very true. Yeah.
So I think that's another aspect that has been overlooked, but that's also one that should be addressed now or should be looked at. A lot of decisions that will be made in the future will be made by, as Bari and only what I've mentioned by, the next generation, and a lot of, and there's been a gap. So, you probably need to provide some counseling or professional support in that area if you really want to move forward and implement what is being undertaken by the current government. Apart from that, I think in terms of business operations, business is very much a part of Bougainvilleans on the ground. And I do strongly believe that through institutes like LOWI or the ANU or researchers, some sort of things could be developed to try and support trade for particularly SMEs, because there are a lot of SMEs on the ground who run their own businesses based on the resources that they own. Thanks.
And to run those business successfully, you need to have a clear and healthy mindset. So yeah, that's a good point you made on having sort of counseling provided for not only business but education and other areas of that will benefit the people. Now we are speaking on investment, and Michael, your work has considered opportunities to strengthen investment between Australia and the Pacific countries. You've been to Bougainville, you've seen the place, you've experienced the culture. Can you tell us about what you see as a potential sector in Bougainville, and what would be the area of focus for Australia in Bougainville through the PNG government?
Thank you. Look, I think, the thing I'm really pumped up on this panel is that I'm the only one not from Papua New Guinea nor Bougainville here. So for my place to, say what I think about it, it really is coming through the context that I work for a trade and investment promotion organisation that is an agency of the Pacific Island Forum. So we work across all 16 Pacific Island countries, including heavily Papua New Guinea by way of that Bougainville. Our main goal really is to try and drive investment into the region and try and get exports out into global markets, including here in Australia, both in my instance. So, I guess that's the lens at which I'm viewing this from. And, to your question, I think the obvious choice and the obvious answer here is inherently cocoa. It is an industry which about, I think it's 2/3 of the population are somewhat engaged, and about 90% of the population are somewhat engaged in agriculture more broadly. We've seen the last decade have a really heavy focus by a variety of different donors and development partners into cocoa. World Bank, IFAD, Australia, New Zealand, ACR. And whilst I'm certainly not on the agriculture end, I understand that that's a lot in the way of different seed varietals, pest control, financial literacy programs, really just a lot of work to get that pathway to market a little bit more robust. And 2024 was a really exciting year globally, and particularly for the Pacific, I think, because we saw cocoa prices reach some all-time highs, and that was due to a lot of different external factors, climate change probably being one of those, droughts in certain parts of the world, West Africa. But it did bring a lot of excitement to those engaged in the cocoa industry in the Pacific, and Bougainville really did see some great things for that, I think. A lot of farmers had been, planting since about 2014 or so. They were ready for that sudden rise in commodity price. And it was an exciting time where I think a lot of us were watching to see what was going to happen here. And we were able to see really the region reap the rewards of that decade-long investment, I suppose. So, it would be remiss not to start with cocoa. Also, as luck would have it for me, perhaps, but right now the Bougainville Chocolate Festival is happening. So, I think that is a really, really key. You can see the momentum that has been built over the last decade and where that has led us. Right now, when I say we in this context, PTI rather, we have a group of interested parties, investors over there from Australia who are looking to sort of form partnerships on the ground. And I think that speaks to even now in the high-risk environment that you mentioned, Laurel, there is still that level of interest to engage on the ground in Bougainville. So cocoa is the exciting one. We were able to work with Delwyn Ketzian, a really wonderful woman entrepreneur, actually, she runs her own organization called DJ Organics. She produces chocolate, and we brought her out to the Australian Chocolate Festival, here in Melbourne earlier this year. And she also met with various buyers and distributors here in Australia, as well as maybe the broader sort of cocoa industry. And there was distinct interest in her products and her story, what she was doing. And even closer to where we are today, a really another exciting example perhaps is, don't know if anyone here is familiar, but there's an organization in Canberra called Jasper and Myrtle who produce chocolate, and they source solely from Bougainville. So there really is that interest in Bougainvillean cocoa and chocolate in the Australian market. And, you know, I think this applies to Pacific products a little bit more broadly as well. But where we see that interest occur is when it is niche, high-end, boutique products that do really, really well in global markets from the Pacific. So we can't compete, and you know, anything coming out of the region, be it Bougainville, Papua New Guinea, or anywhere else in the Pacific, struggles to compete with cost, margins, or scale. It's just not what we have the capacity to compete on. But when it comes to framing, branding, story, provenance, that's when I think there's real opportunity. So there is room for products from Bougainville and cocoa, absolutely, but at that luxury sort of boutique level, where we have seen much success, and anybody that I think we speak to that has decided to go ahead and invest in the region, or even work with the region in any capacity, when we speak to them, they always have a moment that they kind of refer back to. They've been over there at one point or encountered another, you know, business owner from Bougainville, something like that. And it's so strange, but those person-to-person links, irrespective of all the business logic surrounding it, is what draws them to continue working with the region in an ongoing fashion. So that is the most obvious one. But even beyond that, that's not to say, to use Oliver's term, Bougainville's a one-trick pony. I think that there's, you know, other opportunities to be found as well. You know, agriculture more broadly, fisheries, small-scale tourism. I think there's opportunity there in all those different areas. The challenge, however, is in consistency, both in, I think, consistency in supply when it's product and consistency in quality. And, you know, that isn't a challenge unique to Bougainville per se, nor a criticism. It is a challenge that we see time and time again, but it is something to sort of, I guess, be aware of, right? That reliability in what is being produced as it moves through the supply chain. I think the other thing that I'm really cognizant of, and I spend a lot of time thinking about, is also sustainable economic development. So things that aren't just short-term windfalls, but how, and I'm really lucky, I look at the likes of this panel, for instance, and look at these many young Bougainvilleans and think, you know, how is it that Bougainville is going to transform those short-term windfalls into long-term growth? I don't think it's something that I certainly have an answer for per se, but it is a challenge and one that I think is an exciting prospect to look towards as well.
Thank you. I think you're right. In 2024, the cocoa farmers in Bougainville were making lots of money.
Yeah.
And yeah, they were just building their houses and just improving their lifestyle. So it was good. It's different from the extractive industry where the money, you know, goes through so many people before reaching the actual like hardworking people. So yeah, cocoa is one of the most important produce that just puts the money back into the farmer. So yeah, that's a really good one, and thank you for that. How is everyone feeling? I hope we're not putting everyone to sleep. I'll go through my second round of questions. Oliver, I'll come back to you.
Sure.
With 2027 fast approaching, the date has been set September 1st. That's like what, 15 days before PNG's independence. There's a lot of uncertainty about Bougainville independence, what it might look. How do you see Bougainville's independence approaching? Bougainville's independence aspirations evolving, and what will it take to make them a success? Also, how would you see the next chapter of the relationship between PNG and Bougainville?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. I'll try and answer as, I guess, succinctly as I can. I think, you know, the independence aspirations would be, that's a question that everyone's sort of asking for. Like I mentioned, I sort of foreshadowed earlier, right? I try to sort of stay away from that because I think it means so many different things to different people. So my answer shouldn't be taken as really representative of larger views, obviously. I think I'd love to see in terms of the independence aspirations, people really, Bougainvilleans themselves, questioning what this means for them, really. and how exactly that will sort of be achieved, right? And I think that's going to vary from Bougainvillian to Bougainvillian. And I think when I approach the paper, I think I've treated it really as a political reality. I think there will be some sort of decisions made in September 2027, but I can't speculate on the outcome. I really don't know how that will sort of look like. On the second part of that question, I think is where I turn most of my focus to, which is how do we look at the relationship between PNG and Bougainville? And this is an important question, I think, that a lot of people need to be asking. What struck me the most when I was doing my research, and even before the research started taking off, is sort of how politically the engagement happens. I thought it was quite surprising that the national government tends to give a lot of respect to the Bougainvillian. The relationship is quite cordial, but it's almost as if they're dealing with Bougainville already as another country, like altogether, which I always thought was quite surprising, because it's not a subnational government. It has a high level with its autonomy arrangement that's in place. But the way I sort of view it, and it may not be incorrect, is there was still a bit of sort of that constitutional supremacy around the decision of Bougainville's political future that PNG still had, but they would always come to the negotiation tables I viewed as sort of equals. And if that was the way that they were engaging with each other, I think that a lot more thinking now has to happen on the Bougainville side in terms of how do you approach this as a relationship or as a partnership together. So this is not only saying that, you know, what you were sort of talked about, saying that the national government needs to do better and sort of deliver on sort of its promises. But I think the Bougainvillian side as well has to also think about what can we actually do for PNG, right? There's a lot of dependency on what happened, you know, just immediately post-independence for PNG and sort of economic contributions at the time. And I think now we sort of need to turn a new chapter, and Bougainville has to start thinking whether or not it does get independence, how can it sort of start reinventing itself as like a key partner for the national government as well? And I think that's how they should be focusing the narrative moving forward. And I think in a way, we're sort of lucky now with the political leadership that we have. Depending on how you compare different approaches that former prime ministers have taken on the national side to Bougainville, Marape seems to be somebody who's willing to, Prime Minister Marape, sorry, seems to be someone who's willing to compromise. I think on the Bougainville front with President Toroama, although, you know, in the paper I sort of criticized their sustainable development plan because for the substance itself, and sort of offering some tweaks there. I think that as a leader, he's kind of the person that you want because he's so transparent, right? Because you know exactly what he's going to push for. And that's something that you can't even get with, I think, national government MPs, right? You're worried about a lot of people, like there's a lot of political backsliding. And I haven't been able to see that with Toroama. So I think it makes it easy for a lot of people to navigate around that. So I think the people that you have at the forefront is probably the best that we're going to get. And I think this is where you need to introducing the conversation as to how do we build this relationship moving forward.
Thank you. And we've got like 1 year and a few months before 2027, so the work needs to happen. Barry, civil society has played an important role since the peace agreement. I'm rushing because of time. How can citizen engagement and community leadership continue to sharpen the governance in Bougainville as it moves towards 2027?
Yeah, thanks, Theckla. I'll keep it brief as well. Like I think the most important thing that, and like civil society is already building a lot, as mentioned by panelists, we have like Nazareth Center for Rehabilitation, people that have been working on post-conflict, but also our institutions. So it's not to take away from the work that's already being done. I think for me, one of the biggest issues that came about from the referendum was that there wasn't sufficient public dialogue about what the two options meant. What does freedom mean? What does greater autonomy mean? There wasn't the same level of civic engagement to articulate and debate those concepts so that the people could understand what they were voting for. And so if we down the road look at gradations of independence, where you might not get a seat at the UN, but you get your own currency, or you have your own flag, or these kind of things, we look at the issues and we start interpreting what the solutions might be without consulting the public. And so it's important to have that civil society engagement at this stage. If we have September 1st, the most important thing is to start discussing how does the bill get tabled in Parliament? Who's responsible? We should be having citizen groups. We have a lot of media professionals from Bougainville. They should be out there having programs, dialogue, look at Timor-Leste, invite speakers from Timor-Leste over. How did they go through? What were the lessons they learned? When did they establish their sovereign wealth fund? Where are they now? What do they wish Indonesia had done then? Those kind of dialogues and discussions should be facilitated not just by development partners, but by Papua New Guineans and Bougainvilleans, again, acting with mutual respect and understanding within the rule of law and the framework that we have. So I see the important role of civil society is really discussing and explaining the concepts and making sure that people are engaged. So whatever happens on the September 1st, 2027, it's not something that hasn't been discussed. That's the most important role that we can have at this stage, in addition to what people in Bougainville are already doing. And I'm also from civil society, so I feel like it's too much to labor civil society with a lot of problems that should be managed by what taxpayers fund, both in Australia and in Papua New Guinea. So there's a role that civil society plays, but it shouldn't be shouldering the burden. It should be based off official communication, official documents, minutes from meetings should come out. There should be public briefings every month about what's happening. So civil society has a role, government has a role, everyone has a role.
And communication is key. It's like you have to communicate to get the message across, and then you have to respond to the response from that message that you get across.
It's like if you're an expecting mother, you can't force the baby to go back. You got to have the baby shower. You got to have the room ready and the cradle there. So you can't just surprise yourself and hope that you don't have that baby coming. So there has to be practical steps that have to be done, and you have to start communicating, start getting people ready, and start preparing. You can't walk back things and delay and hope that a government that comes in 2027 in PNG will be able to fulfill what should be done now. And that's only presented in the paper. That's been the failure, that there hasn't been that follow through with what was agreed. In Melanesia, it's easy to kill a pig and make peace, but when you have to make the garden access to water, who goes where, who pays what bride price, what debts are there, the practicalities is where we get entangled. So we kill the pig, but we need to make sure that the day-to-day lives are actually followed through with and implemented, and that's where civil society comes in.
Thank you. Good example with the pregnant mother. Laurel, I'll come to you. If you have to give one piece of advice to Bougainvilleans, current or the next generation, what would it be to navigate through that conversation on independence horizon? Just
My
one
one
advice.
line.
Yeah, one line is okay. One line is okay.
Just Rome was not built in a day. But if I had to just quickly expand on that, I would probably tell them that I think it's important to keep the lines of communication open always. Also to have an open mind when you're exposed to new systems, but also be very selective in who you choose to communicate with in the future, and in your engagement. But and also just when being selective, to remain true to your executing role, to your goals, and really to your beliefs.
Thank you. That was short and sharp. We're 1 minute into question time. Our final question, Michael, with Bougainville seeking to attract international investors, including plans for a joint venture in the Panguna mine, how would you assess this current investment climate? What policy or institutional reforms could help enhance investor confidence and long-term economic prospects?
You can't ask me a question like that. No, look, I think with any large-scale extractive project, let's speak the Panguna mine part there, it's going to draw a certain level of attention, right? But at the same time, I would argue that it's less about the specific opportunity in reference to the investing climate, and more about whether the supporting environment really can cater to that, can support that opportunity, right? Or that investment attraction. I don't think it would be, on the nose to say that in the lead up towards 2027 in particular, that the investment climate is a little bit more high risk for investors. And by no means is that a criticism. I think it's just rather a reflection of where the region is at in its journey, as you were saying, Laura, Rome wasn't built in a day, right? And, you know, I think that just is how it is for now. The ultimate investment environment, and I'm personally that I work across the Pacific region, so it's probably isn't always the most ultimate investment environment, right? But it's one where rules are clear, investors can build up a level of confidence, there are transparent processes, there's a strong business enabling environment where ultimately in layman's terms, if you're going to be putting your money in and investing into a region, you can be sure that you're going to achieve a certain return on that investment. Stable political cycles, for instance, another part of that. So all these things I think we've been speaking about really feed into that idea of investor confidence, right? Now, in terms of reform, though, I think there's a few different paths to that. There has been some early progress made, and I think steps in the right direction, particularly around the ongoing reforms of the Bougainville tax office, for instance. And I think there's a good early first steps. But I think there are a few steps along that journey that are still to go as well. I think there's probably a need to strengthen the Bougainville public service a little bit so that investors know that those policies, whilst well-intentioned, will be also applied predictably in an ongoing fashion. There's also a need for, you know, further business enabling infrastructure as well. So everything from consistent power, telecommunications, ports, wharves, roads, all those other pieces of the puzzle that really allow businesses to function on a commercial level. That inherently also builds investor confidence, right? I think particularly in the lead up towards 2027, another part of that puzzle is going to be the intergovernmental relations between Buka and Moresby. How are those channels of communication, are they stable, clear, consistent? I think that speaks to a little bit as two of you were speaking to there as well. So I think, look, in the interim, the investment climate is still a little bit more high risk. But in the short term, that's not to say that there isn't also opportunity. Something that we've been exploring a little bit has been impact investors, I suppose. So those investors who aren't necessarily just looking for a level of commercial return, but are also looking for a level of values-aligned investment. And I think there is something to that that is worth expanding upon. I've had a few really lovely discussions with other people who believe similarly, I suppose. And then the other one, and I look around the room here a little bit, I think, when I say this, but in the short term, is the role that diaspora play in that short term, bridging the gap, I suppose, between ideal future states and where we are now, and the role that diaspora play in nation building from an investment perspective as well. And I think that it's really for those in the room, there's a skin in the game that are going to bridge that gap between now and then. But ultimately, I suppose, you know, investment follows confidence and confidence follows clarity, right? So for Bougainville, there's that real focus, if you're wanting to build investor confidence, to make sure that all those systems are robust, are clear, transparent, and then applied predictably and consistently. No small challenge, but
challenge. Yeah, true. 2027 is the year. I'm conscious about our time, but before we take questions, Ollie, there's this question that I really want to get your response on.
Sure.
It's again on the future of Bougainville, but it's the future of Bougainville is like largely dependent on the outcome of the post-referendum political negotiation. It's like requires strong political leadership on both sides. And that's like PNG government and the ABG. Now, firstly, how would you describe the nature of the relationship between these two, the two governments? And secondly, could you offer an assessment of the political engagement by both governments? What has worked? What would you like to see done differently, either by both governments? And if you can keep your response.
Yeah, really short. That's okay. I think it's hard for me to sort of gauge for the assessment to be made on my part. It's purely from my own assessment of the government. I think it's also I can only assess the performance of particularly the Bougainville government and the national government based on my expectations of them. And I think across Bougainville, and we've just had the elections recently, there's such a low expectation that's provided by everyone else, right? And what I mean is that I was lucky enough to be in Buin, where I'm from, for the issuance of the writs of these elections. And a lot of the conversations that you have with sort of the people at the local level is that when they asked about, oh, who are you voting for in this election, I don't think I heard anyone saying, oh, I'm voting for this person because they're going to deliver independence. They're just like every other Papua New Guinean, where they're like, has this guy given us roads? Are our roads better? The services all right? Have they forgotten about us completely? And I think like what it introduces and the sort of eye opener for me was that there's such I kind of see that there's a bit of a disparity, and I might get in trouble for sort of saying this, right? But there's I think that a lot of what you see in a lot of the media, the news about independence and the narrative that's pushed there is largely centralized at the House of Representatives up in Kubul in Buka. I think a lot of Bougainvilleans on the ground have frustrations like a lot of other Papua New Guineans have as well, like what's our local member doing? And I think it was quite evident in the results of these elections now, where there are different expectations for different levels of government. For your constituents, I think there's a big emphasis on what can you deliver for us in terms of development locally, which is why somebody like Toroama was able to win by landslide, because they see him as pushing that independence front. That's your responsibility. But for the local level government, there was a high turnover rate, right? It doesn't make sense because if the leader of the government was able to come in with so much confidence, why is it that the people below him and those who are supposed to be part of his posse, I guess, if you will, not coming back in as well, right? And I think it speaks to some of the complexities around how the Bougainvilleans view that. But sorry, back to the question. I think it depends on the expectations, and what you said, I agree completely. I think we need to communicate the expectations a lot better. I think, as I mentioned earlier, the relationship is good, and we probably have the best two people there to push that. But I think we need to manage the expectations both locally on both sides. And I think not just the Bougainvilleans to their leaders, but also the national government as well. I think everyone else in PNG should be having a say on how they view this Bougainville issue as well. So I don't know if that answers the question, but that's.
I think
Yeah.
that's in a way.
Yeah.
It's managing the expectations.
Yeah.
Thank you, Ollie. Okay, we're into our question time now, and I am going to open up the floor for questions. And if you have a question, you are most welcome to ask your question to any of the panelists here, exclude me. And yeah, and I'll just ask our panelists to answer other questions in as simple as they can, because we might have a lot of questions.
Maybe if there's anyone online as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, cool.
Ollie is trying to take over my job. If there's anyone online, you can let us know by raising your hand or typing out your question.
We have 4 questions online already.
Great.
Oh.
Okay. Maybe we should start with the ones online.
In which one?
Yeah, thank you.
Start from Joe. Actually, he has a couple. Do you think the re-election of President Toroama was the preferred outcome for the PNG central government? And the second question from Joe is, what powers have been transferred to ADG from the PNG central government? What have been kept from PNG central government?
Who's the question, sir? Who's the question? Is it directed to anyone?
Joe Pin.
Oh, sorry, is it directed to anyone?
Oh, no.
No, okay, I guess I'll try and answer that. So the first one is what is the attitude of sort of the central government with the re-election of Toroama? Are they happy that Toroama is back? Or I think it's one of those questions that depends on who you ask, right? So if you're someone who doesn't support independence, you wouldn't be happy with that. Toroama, to his credit, has actually achieved, I think, a fair bit in terms of what he was able to. A lot of agreements were signed, I think, with the national government since his tenure, since he took that up in 2020, if I remember correctly. So if the view is that and I had the pleasure of talking with President Toroama during my research, right? And I think his view of it is quite, and he talks about this as well when he does his media engagements. He doesn't see it purely from the point of saying it's an independence push, but I think he wants to resolve this long-standing process, right? I think people it's just hanging there, and he wants to sort of complete that loop. So I think with that, regardless of whatever the outcome is, I think it's good also for the central government, the national government, sorry, that he is there, that they can sort of bring some sort of resolution to this over 2 decade long process that they've been engaged in. And the other question, sorry, was on the powers. I think when I was doing my research paper, I think if I remember the numbers correctly, I think it was 9 powers have been drawn down, over I think 54. I don't know if I'm making up these numbers that have been accorded, and I don't think it's a result of the national government holding back powers. I think it goes with what was discussed in the paper, how I don't think that there's a clarity on how this drawdown process can take place. And what we've seen with the Sharp Agreement, when it removed a lot of the prerequisites before the drawdown could take place, is we're seeing a proliferation now of MOUs being signed. But the problem is, and these are concerns within the Bougainville government as well, where you can say on paper that we've transferred these powers over to you, but the biggest question is, do you actually have the capacity to exercise them? I think that's a more important question there. So it's not about how many boxes it ticked off. I think it's talking about what are the powers that the Bougainville government can actually exercise. Yeah.
Thank you, Ollie. We'll take a question from the
Yep.
auditorium.
I'm impressed how relaxed you seem to be about the process going forward, given the intensity of feeling past to be aware of. So I'd just like to ask you a little bit more. I'll direct this primarily to Oliver about, whether you feel things are more relaxed because of this sort of relationship that's been developing with the centre. The second part to my question is the economic side. We all know that Bougainville cannot really develop in the way it should economically till mining gets going again. Is there an understanding of that and a willingness to address that?
Okay, thank you. So the first question was about how I see in terms of the intensity, right? And I'm sort of relaxed in that approach. Yeah, look, I think these are purely from sort of my observations. I've been able to go back a lot over the past few years, really over the past 10 years, and what I've seen is that the results of the referendum were quite telling, right? And once again, this is something that I might get in trouble for saying, but I think that if anything, we should see this vote as something that's quite indicative, right? It's almost as if you're asking someone a question, what's your preference really, right? And people would love to get independence, and as is their right to do so. But people are not waking up every morning frustrated that they don't have independence yet, right? And I think there's also a lack of understanding on the ground. Some people feel that there's a misunderstanding, right, because of the lack of the communication. Some people feel like they already have independence as well, right? I think that there is a concern, and I think both of the governments are sort of managing this, where I don't think that we're going to reach a point politically where the national government will be brave enough to say, no, you can't have independence. They're probably going to try as much as possible to work on something that it's a bit of a compromise, right? In true Melanesian spirit, that's what they're going to try and land on. And I think that's I don't bet, but if I was going to bet my money, it's going to be something along those lines. And the second part as well, yeah, the mining question is something that's really big. A lot of people. One of the intricacies around that as well is why I focused a lot more on socio-economic development, and I didn't really address the mine. Is you said it quite beautifully, sort of the story of the Panguna and sort of the landowners and free prior informed consent is something that we see across in PNG as well. And with the mining question, I don't think I'm the right person to sort of address this. I think a lot of people agree that it's going to be a massive economic injection, but the questions around the mine itself is better reserved for someone who's from the mining area. Because I think what a lot of people need to realize as well is that the benefits that are derived from the mine will go directly to the land, and similar to what you see around PNG, right? So for me, someone who's from the south, I don't have any direct benefit from the mine itself operating, which is why I've never had an incentive to really look at the mine itself, right? So I do agree. Yeah, I think I'll be really comfortable to say that the mine is necessary. If I can ever get and this hasn't been done before, this is a big data gap. What is the price or what is the cost of running an independent Bougainville, delivery of services, essentially, whatever? Can we meet that cost with sort of the renewable sector and all these other areas except mining, or do we need mining for it, right? And I think that's going to be the sort of logical step towards that.
Yeah, I might add to what Oli mentioned in the question in terms of the process. You're saying that we seem a bit more relaxed as opposed to previously when you were part of the process. I also think that, or I also believe in my view as well, that I think there was some degree of uncertainty. The referendum hadn't been undertaken. Both sides weren't sure if that was going to be fulfilled or that commitment was going to be honored. Now that the referendum has been done democratically, the results have been given, the next step is the negotiation now. So that's also an indicator that what has been agreed during the BPA is being honored to some extent or to some degree by both sides of government, PNG government as well as the ABG. Your second question, I think, was in line with the mind. What was the question?
The question was sort of on reopening the mind to support.
Well, reopening the mind, opening new minds, because there are other perspective areas, of course. But essentially, it's essential to really rebuilding a strong economy at the moment. But I think, Oliver, in your answer, you also indicated, there's not a strong desire for that. There's even a bit of a focus on renewables, which you've been discussing about. So, maybe there's not that great desire for that economic injection.
Yeah, I think that comes down to just the time factor and really if you want to get rich overnight or develop everything's get
That one, not after that, you actually just reminded something.
yes. I think it just comes down to the time factor and the decision is really, I think, up to the government on the ground and the people. Do you want to open a lot of minds to have some fast cash, fast money to develop and reach your political aspirations, or are you willing to get into renewable resources? And obviously that will take much longer. As Michaela has mentioned as well, it's also a lot to do with robust systems, and the administration needs to also ensure, I think, that those systems are intact and in place in order to ensure that these renewable resources are able to sustain the political aspirations or the economy of Bougainville in the absence of opening numerous mines.
If I could sort of add on that one, on the, I think as we move along and as sort of the time drags, I think you're going to find this relaxed perception is going to grow even more. Because I think one of the things that a lot of people can't measure is sort of the generational impacts as well. Like Laurel and I are sort of like the muggles of the Bougainville people, like we're halfies, right? Where we have one parent is from Bougainville, the other's from Papua New Guinea, right? And we grew up, well, sorry, I'll speak for myself. I grew up in a generation where a lot of my studies, my economic opportunities and everything was founded in the national government, right? I'm a public servant. And as this goes on, people are going to start, the dynamics will change, right? And you can't really foresee it, but you can sort of see the trend that it's following. That's one thing. And then the other one that you mentioned as well, which I think is really important, and I think you answered it well, is sort of the timeline issue. One thing I couldn't figure out when I was doing these is that I feel like these timelines are set, but we also have to agree that we get frustrated when we're not achieving what we want to achieve by the timeline. But we have to realize as well that we set the timelines ourselves, right? So it could be that to begin with, the timeline that we set is already infeasible, right? And then we just end up getting frustrated with the process. But maybe we just need to sort of remove timelines. And one of the things that I guess I did propose, shameless plug, like in the paper, was that removing timelines, but actually looking at quantifiable targets that you're trying to achieve together. So that's sort of that's all. Yeah.
That sounds like delaying independence.
No,
Makes sense.
Maybe we'll go to one of the questions online.
Yeah, we have two questions again from one person, Nancy, for Oliver. This is a question on the politics of infrastructure delivery across the island and how the new Bougainville government is looking to address this. The recommendation for special authority as a vehicle for equitable development seems to be also a discussion around transparency of infrastructure delivery. Your report pointed out that the BRDA was enacted, then repealed within 5 years. Does this suggest that a mechanism that is state-led or seen to be sanctioned by the state still has to deal with issues of trust? And the second question from him is additionally the risk of relying on disbursement from the PNG government comes with its own issues. Would this undermine Bougainville's political desires for sovereignty?
Yeah, that's interesting. The first question, I can't speak too much because I think it's almost asking for like a perspective on the Bougainville government. I can't really speak on them, but in terms of sort of the infrastructure priorities. Also, I can't really speak on whether or not there is sort of a politicization of the infrastructure development and where that happens. What I did sort of find in my sort of research around the BRDA, it wasn't necessarily about where the infrastructure projects are taking place. All throughout Bougainville, you sort of see, I guess, an equal amount of disbursement of projects that we're seeing now, especially those that are funded by donors. There's a lot taking off in South Bougainville. You have the roads that are being done in Central Bougainville as well as up in North. So that's that. Like the question around the BRDA, from what I saw, was more of a question of the control mechanisms for the restoration and development grant that was coming in, right? And I can't say this with authority, but sort of what was hinted is that the question wasn't about who gets to decide where the project was. I think it was more a question of who controls the money, right? And I go in like in the paper to talk about sort of the governance concerns that I have as well around that. The dependency question is really interesting. It's a good question because I've never really sort of thought about that, right? And I think I'll lean back on what you had mentioned before in terms of saying that both the national government and the Bougainville government have obligations that they need to fulfill. And I think we try to approach that in good faith. I think Bougainville really does need the RDG money to be coming in, and I hope that they do get that. But then once that money comes across as well, then there's another question about accountability and how well we sort of utilize that. But I've never really thought about it in the dependency angle. It's actually weird when I'm thinking about it now because we're having a lot more discussions on PNG dependency with Australia, with the 50th independence, and even with the whole Papua Treaty. So I haven't actually thought about that. So that was a really good question. Yeah.
Thank you. Anyone in here with another question? Yes.
Yeah, I'd like to ask about the draft constitution for independent Bougainville, which I understand is now ready and being there for public participation. Would you know what does it say about socio-economic rights and how much these type of provisions were debated as part of public consultations? Was there a national or Bougainville discussion around socio-economic rights and the future developed constitution should say about rights? Anyone who
You
I was considering to take questions to this.
Yeah, do you want to take the next question as well?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, from Charlie, I think it was. Yeah.
Did anyone else have a question?
Another question.
So I was just going to make a comment about the issue that you mentioned at the beginning on the as to whether Bougainville should be economically and socially ready for independence before independence is granted. What people forget about the decolonisation process that happened after World War II is that very many of the colonial territories that had a right to self-determination and UN membership, many of them were tiny and totally unready. Nauru had a population of less than 10,000, and the Pacific's a wonderful example. There was only Papua New Guinea with a population of more than 1 million out of all of the 22 territories, colonial territories in the region. And how that was dealt with, it was not an obstacle to countries becoming independent because they weren't ready. Instead, the parent state took responsibility for continuing to do many, many things and provide all sorts of supports, and have continued to step in when pressures have happened. Papua New Guinea itself is a classic example where there's a huge amount of support from PNG, from Australia early, and now there's increasing support, so much so that there's talk about recolonisation from the south. So I think it's a mistake to go down the readiness path too strongly. And that's where I would tend to agree with you in saying that we'll probably get some sort of compromise whereby Bougainville has most of the apparatus of independence, but PNG keeps quite significant roles and functions. Another example from the Pacific in that regard is the three Micronesian states, Federated States of Micronesia, Marshall Islands, and Palau, where the US is the former colonial or whatever, the UN Trust Territory, of course, but they kept significant powers ad infinitum. powers over security and defence and bases and so on. And that's not seen as inimical to those countries becoming UN member states. So it's quite possible to have UN member states where all sorts of powers and functions stay with the parent state, either long-term or short-term. The only difference with Bougainville is that it's not a colony on its own, so it doesn't have the same legal rights. But there's no reason why the same mechanism shouldn't be used.
Thank you. To answer that one, I actually can't answer the question on the Bougainville Constitution because I wouldn't know really if they have addressed it in there. So sorry, good question. But if you would like me to, I will go and read it after it from Oh yeah, you got.
I mean, so for you,
Yeah, sure.
just being someone on the ground, there was some consultation undertaken whilst I was there. The government did that, I think, through a committee that they formed. So I think in terms of the finer details and the technicalities behind it, do that research. I was there when they had an undertaking to complete and to do that consultation, just as they did for the national government pre-independence.
Just wanted to respond to what Prof. Regan was saying. I appreciate that, like, the history of the Pacific and the independence movements were not as much prevalent because of the UN's role looking after trust territories. I think the qualifier for Bougainville is obviously the conflict, and that sets a different pathway. I think it's highly unusual. Like, for instance, you don't see the French celebrating Haitian independence and giving them funding. You don't see the British in India celebrating their Independence Day. It's highly unusual to have former colonizers celebrating the former colonies' independence, bankrolling and engaging that level. I think that conflict dimension distinguishes Bougainville in respect to decolonization in the Pacific. And you look at West Papua, for instance, and the ongoing conflict in there. So because of that, the blood that's been shed, it's difficult to think of it in terms of the decolonization process in the Pacific. I think there's a greater sense of obligation, I feel, as a Papua New Guinean, looking at it to honor the mandate, not just of the vote, but because of the people that lost their lives in the conflict and continue to be impacted. I also, to the earlier question about Pacific economies, there's a lot of different models in the Pacific. I think it's only Bougainville, PNG, and Timor-Leste that have substantial mineral resources apart from the ones that are doing deep sea mining. Most of the Pacific economies depend on remittance. Like, this is the model for small island developing states in the Pacific and globally as well. So it's not a, obviously Panguna is there, but it's not a given in our region. I just feel, just want to advise.
Thank you. I'm just very conscious of the time. It's 2 minutes to our deadline. I think not deadline, but like finishing time. And I'll probably, the questions that are online, I'll probably let Oliver answer them later. Not now, because it's almost 3:30. And I will bring this to a conclusion. Bougainville is always a very important topic. It is always a sensitive topic back home. So we sort of, like, in my role as a journalist, we try our best not to, take sides or report anything carelessly. So it's really good to be here and to hear the discussions from the panelists here, your experience in the region and in the government system. And yeah, we all want the best for the people of Bougainville. 15,000 lives has been lost and we cannot take those lives back. So it's always a really important topic. And I want to say thank you to Oliver and Lowy Institute for bringing all of us here to talk about Bougainville. Everyone sitting here, the panelists, including myself, we are from the Emerging Leaders, the OSPNG Emerging Leaders Dialogue. And we're happy that they've come back to the network to select us to be here and not get experts from outside. So Oliver, pass our thank you to the Lowy Institute guys, the students here, the professors, everyone who has been here. Thank you, True, for your time here with us. And I think this is the end.